Okay, welcome everybody. I don't think we have bells between sessions, so we'll probably have a few stragglers join us over the next few minutes. Apologies for starting a few minutes late. My name is Debbie Eagles. I am the Director of CSIRO's Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, based down in Geelong. I'll briefly introduce the topic that you're hopefully all here for today. Make sure that you haven't wandered into the wrong room. And then I'll introduce our speakers or panellists before they each step up to present a little bit on this topic before we head to questions. So we're speaking this afternoon about the incredibly important topic of global collaboration in biosecurity and pandemic preparedness. Hugely relevant given what we've all lived through over the last 4 to 5 years, but also very relevant as we head into the future with potential for increased pandemics, and for those in the animal health world or keeping an eye on flus internationally, also relevant as we watch avian influenza H5N1 circulating all around us. So the benefit of being one of the later sessions in the couple of days is we can ride a little bit on the coattails of previous sessions. And I think there's some real learnings that we've heard from some of the sessions today. I particularly wanted to highlight some comments in this morning's session about climate that I think are really relevant to this session as well. And that's the importance of, and I'm taking the words directly from someone's slide this morning, the importance of multilateral cooperation in science support for multilateral climate politics. That's hugely relevant as well as we prepare for pandemics. And I think you'll pick up in our speakers' presentations and the conversations afterwards a little bit about that. The importance of sharing our science quickly and how we prepare to do that. And also the importance of sharing good news stories. Not always really easy when we do biosecurity and pandemic preparedness. So all of these are really related to what we'll discuss this afternoon as we talk about biosecurity, pandemic preparedness, and the breadth of research infrastructure that contributes to that. And our three panellists will give you three very different perspectives on relevant research infrastructure that brings that's relevant in this space. So I'm going to introduce each of our panellists straight up and then ask them to pop up and each speak before we head into questions. So firstly, introducing Professor Brett Sutton. Brett is the Director of Health and Biosecurity at CSIRO. He's a qualified public health physician with extensive experience and clinical expertise in public health and communicable diseases, gained through experience in government, emergency medicine and field-based international work. He holds specialist knowledge in tropical medicine and infectious disease and has held a variety of roles including emergency medicine, complex humanitarian environments, field-based international work and several senior positions in government, including the role of Victoria's Chief Health Officer together with the role of Victoria's Chief Human Biosecurity Officer. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor David Lai. David is the Director of the Infectious Disease Research and Training Office at the National Centre for Infectious Disease. David is also currently Deputy Executive Director of the Program for Research in Epidemic Preparedness and Response, PREPARE, in Singapore. His research interests are in COVID-19, dengue and antimicrobial resistance, and he's published more than 390 peer-reviewed manuscripts. And finally, to introduce Professor Thomas Schultes, who leads the Swiss National Supercomputing Centre, CSCS, which develops and operates high-performance computing and data research infrastructure to advance world-class science in Switzerland and beyond. CSCS, which is open to scientists worldwide, collaborated with 4 other centres in 2020 to provide urgent computing resources through the Partnership for Advanced Computing in Europe to support COVID-19 research. Today, CSCS is facilitating the development of open data-driven large language and multimodal models with applications in medicine. And additionally, through the International Computation and AI Network, CSCS is ramping up its support for data scientists and medical institutions across Africa. So welcome to our panellists, and I'd now like Brett to step up and present.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Debbie, for the introduction. Great to be here, great to see everyone. And thank you, Debbie, for saving us from being a male-only panel, the dreaded manel, nothing worse. So Next slide. That's in my hands. Good. I think we're only going to spend about 5 minutes each and then literally go to audience participation. There have been a few sessions here that have been reasonably heavy on monologues and a bit light on audience participation, so we're going to turn it around this time. That said, I could spend the next 50 minutes on this piece of research infrastructure. It is quite extraordinary. The Australian Centre for Disease Preparedness, previously known as the Australian Animal Health Laboratory, long history of support of the animal health sector and animal diagnostics, international WOAH and FAO centre, but the name change in 2020 was also reflective of a broader scope of research that was much more inclusive of human health focused research, including pandemic prevention, mitigation, preparedness. It is an extraordinary centre, and people who haven't been there, who just see the photo, can't quite apprehend, I think, what it means to be 10,000 square metres with 1,000 HEPA filters of a giant concrete box inside another giant concrete box. It is it's shopping centre meets nuclear facility, really, and it enables the science that is done there by virtue of that design. It's probably the most extraordinary designed and budgeted research infrastructure in Australia's history, and maybe in the world, because it was built for under $200 million in 1985. We're halfway through its life. It's got another 50, 60 years to go. And it has become the infrastructure template for all other high biocontainment facilities in the world. So it has high biocontainment infrastructure. It's the largest PC3, PC4 lab in the Southern Hemisphere. It's the only one that has large animals, and there's only a handful of those globally, and I think that's the unique value proposition for this particular piece of research infrastructure. That is all enabled by that box in a box with layers and layers of negative pressure. So it's not just the biosafety level that protects the human being from exposure to the high pathogen, it's also everything inside that box in a box stays there. So it is protecting Australia's animal industry, Australia's human population, and the external environment from those high consequence pathogens. It's got proven vaccine research capability, and on the long history of its animal diagnostic work, as a reference lab globally, the ISO quality assurance. What have we done with it? Lab science for high-path viruses is really a key capability. It does include many that are entirely animal-focused, but there are obviously a lot that go into that One Health space. Zoonotic diseases that have high consequences for human populations. Absolutely lent in during the COVID-19 pandemic to study the SARS-CoV-2 genome and the critical preclinical trials that were required for various vaccine candidates. The only BSL-4 vaccine ever produced, the Hendra virus vaccine for animals, nonetheless, that foundational work and the entire development pathway for that vaccine was done at ACDP. Ferret model for COVID-19, and then those reference capabilities. Preclinical models, so those that high biocontainment lab and the deep expertise of the scientists in this setting has allowed the testing of vaccine and therapeutic trials in animals and non-animal models up to a GLP-like quality standards and principles. With the kind of supporting infrastructure within that facility, including AI and ML probabilistic modelling and assay development. Some other very fine examples. In silico optimisation of therapeutic payloads, host pathogen responses for H1N1 pandemic influenza, in vitro characterisation with SARS-CoV-2, and there's significant work in bat-borne viruses as well. So it's all the nasties. It's all the really, really high consequence pathogens that have to be in a setting like this because the regulators and the governments, from a genuine public health risk point of view, but also a reputational risk point of view, require that these viruses do not escape and do not cause harm to others. And vaccine development and testing, you know, I would put this at the heart of pandemic preparedness and mitigation. It really is a key capability that we want to maintain and grow. And this is not just at ACDP. There's supporting infrastructure across all of CSIRO, you know, an organisation of 6,000 plus people and almost 50 sites around Australia. And so the National Vaccine and Therapeutics Lab, which is where I'm based in Clayton in Melbourne, is in support of that early vaccine production capability, GMP lab, robotic automation, biofoundry for synthetic biology, and then emerging research in RNA therapeutics, bioinformatics, lipid nanoparticle production with novel lipids, and thermal stability encapsulation. All of those are kind of leaning in on that vaccine innovation space, which is a really critical thing going forward. That is it from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. David, over to you.
So just hear about a huge physical structure. I'll now share with you a virtual structure. So you won't see a building the size of ACDP. So our pandemic preparedness research program is called PREPARE. It was funded, one of 4 programs arising out of the pandemic. The other one is on vaccines, another one is on nucleic acid therapeutics, and the last one is RNA biology. And they're all about $100 million over 5 years. And so we hope to seek collaboration regionally and globally. So this slide is just to show you that essentially our leadership is very diverse. I mean, it's led by Ling Fa Wang, an Australian who is a virologist. I'm an ID physician. And then there's a health economist, KB Tan, leading the data science. There's a biomedical engineer leading the fluid dynamics cooperative, and then another biomedical engineer leading diagnostic cooperative. And then a virologist from France leading vaccine therapeutics, and another ID physicians who did a lot of malaria work in the region, leading regional networks. And we report to a steering committee headed by Director of Health. And we also work directly with the Ministry of Health to make sure that our research is policy relevant. And obviously, we report to our funder, which is National Foundation, the equivalent of NHMRC in Singapore, in Australia. So our objective really is to be better ready for the next major outbreak. Now, if it's like COVID pandemic, the world will respond. But if it's like SARS or MERS, it'll be more regional. And we can't depend on EU or US to come up with all the solutions. So we'll have a national epidemic R&D plan. And I've shown you how we have brought together researchers from across different, not just outside of medicine as well, across sectors to work with Ministry of Health and work during normalcy. So now we have no rush. We don't want to be rushed like we did in 2020, and we can accelerate diagnostics, vaccine therapeutics in the next major outbreak. So the idea here is that we'll have better data and science making. So if we have embedded research network in Southeast Asia, at least, with surveillance studies, we will have the ability to do better in data infrastructures and also social behavioral science. I mean, one of the major things out of the pandemic is miscommunication that impair pandemic response. And obviously, I talk about the more traditional science, diagnostic therapeutics and vaccines, and also a strong regional network. We are, however, defined geographically in Southeast Asia. We are not like welcome, which is all over the world, or insular pasture and all that, because we are small. Singapore is a city of 6 million people, smaller than New South Wales and Victoria. So we have 5 cooperatives. The data science basically aims to link the national ministry data as well as hospital patient data. In Singapore, the EMR essentially is Epic and Sunrise Clinical Manager, and we hope to bring it all together. In the pandemic, we look at the data from Israel, from UK, and from US CDC a lot, and we hope to at least be able to provide that first few weeks of information to the rest of the world for the next outbreak. In terms of environmental transmission and mitigation, it's really about a lot of computational fluid dynamics modeling work, as well as the sort of increasing use case of wastewater environmental surveillance. And then for diagnostics, we mainly focus on nucleic acid as well as lateral flow. No one thinks we can swab our cells before the pandemic. Now we know we all can. And also point of care as well as high throughput. And then for vaccine therapeutics, Singapore was advised not to invest in this because of low return of investment years ago, but we now realize we have to. So we focus on mRNA and protein subunits for vaccines, with emphasis on mucosal immunity, as well as persistent longevity and breadth of protection. We know all the problems about the current vaccines for COVID. As well as for therapeutics, broad-spectrum antiviral. I mean, we don't want to develop something just for SARS-2, for example. What about for sarbecovirus or mebecovirus? And also broad neutralizing antibodies. And lastly, all these things are possible with pathogen agnostic. So for example, our diagnostics, we are currently looking at customizing them for H5N1, as well as for Mpox, the platform that's been funded and developed. So one of the key things in line with this particular session is global cooperation. So our original strategy essentially is to have clinical trial capacity, not just in terms of running a clinical trial, but manpower, all the things about agreements, ethics, sample flow. Our model is basically partnership. So samples will be analyzed locally, but the data will be shared across the network, and so that we can get sort of early information. So for example, if there is a sarbecovirus or there's an avian influenza that caused a little outbreak somewhere in Indochina, everyone in the region will know about it. Oops, that's 5 minutes. And we work with Gates Foundation as well as Advanced ID, and we also brought REMAPCAP into Southeast Asia. REMAPCAP is very strong in North America and Europe pre-pandemic, but not in Southeast Asia. So these are our sites, 14 sites across 4 countries. And in terms of global cooperation, so far we have got a few engagement. So for example, that is a visit from China led by Professor Chung Nanshan. He was the person that leads COVID response in China. There's a big Guangzhou lab funded by the Chinese government. And we also had 3 workshops funded by our sovereign fund, the Temasek Foundation. The first one on genomics diagnostics, mostly around Southeast Asia. The second one is on clinical trials. That's in collaboration with Advanced ID, which was funded by Wellcome Trust. So we have got participants from not just Southeast Asia, but across Asia. And the last one was wastewater surveillance in collaboration with Gates and HERA. So we have participants basically from all across the world. So far we have funded 42 projects in 7 countries to the tune of 42 million. This for the first 2 years. And that's all I have to share. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. Sorry, David. A great example of a virtual network. And Thomas is going to talk to us about another virtual network relevant to pandemic preparedness. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you, Debbie, for the introduction. Okay, now I need to. Good. So we are a supercomputing facility. The mission is we develop and operate an HPC and data research infrastructure that supports world-class science in Switzerland. Science is obviously an international or global endeavor, so our infrastructure is open to scientists around the world. And we are also networked within Europe, and there is a network of HPC infrastructures with the US and East Asia, Japan, and even Australia. You can now ask, what does that have to do with the pandemic? And we had the kind of luck or misfortune to have this pandemic in Europe hitting us as well as everywhere else in the world, and we had to react. And the reaction, I would say, when I look back, was quite successful. I was asked over lunch, how do you know how to prepare for, because we don't know what type of science will be relevant. And I think the preparation was pretty good because we had this partnership in Europe for advanced computing, PRACE. And we worked in the years 2014 to 17 very hard to have a common access to our research infrastructures, common assessment of the quality. And we were all open within Europe's. And then when the pandemic hit and we were asked to somehow contribute, all we had to do is take this access process, adapt it to the situation, essentially speed it up, but we could maintain the same quality and then just be open to whatever comes. And so that was the graph on the left shows that they managed to adapt this. And then on the right, we have a graph of what actually came. And so it turned out to be very important to be ready for biostructural type of research, fluid dynamics, epidemiology, and basically modeling of transmission. But then you also see the caveat here that not every scientific application is ready to run on these types of infrastructures. And this is one of the lessons we learned, and not just for pandemic response, but generally. And so the new infrastructure we are developing or are now have deployed in Switzerland is this ALPS infrastructure, which is still a supercomputer that is ranked among the top 10 on the world, but now can be partitioned into different software-defined clusters, and then these can be adapted to specific problems. And this adaptation can be done relatively quickly. And one example that I want to just jump into that is related to the topic we have here, we have these AI-based large language models that are trained generally, foundation models, and then adapted to specific problem. And one example is this open access Meditron model that's being developed at our sister school, EPFL, in Lausanne. Currently, it is based on Llama 3 and is now, as we speak, being trained on a completely open data set. And the point of that is that we can study and then try to remove, for example, or avoid cultural biases or other type of problems that these closed data language models have. Now, so far so good. One of the experiences we made, I guess this year with this Mpox pandemic, where pretty much in Europe our scientists were not at the time scale that we are relevant, interested. But we learned this in other areas as well, is that we need to somehow connect the infrastructures to places where the action is going on on the planet, and let local people run, not us tell them what to run, but basically have boots on the ground. And one example is Annie Hartley, that she's from South Africa and maintains a network of research connections to medical facilities through Africa in about 20 countries. And she has developed this massive open online validation and evaluation of this Meditron model. And the lesson, so this is one of the good things. This is a way to spread the model into wherever you need it. The lesson we learn here is that we can set up the inference infrastructure on our system in Lausanne, but in order to make it really work, we need to distribute this infrastructure, not very big computers, but small versions throughout Africa or throughout the world. And this is where the Gates Foundation is going to help us. And then let me see, I was here. Okay, and then finally, we discovered in the context of, the UN is trying to respond now to the AI challenges, and we were compelled to work with a number of countries, Finland, Cambridge University, and we discovered in these collaborations a network in Africa, Data Science Africa, which is pretty much data scientists trained just the way we are, but they are, again, spread over many places, and they work on their problems. For example, plant disease in response to climate adaptation, or, again, medical and clinical problems. And I think these are now wonderful opportunities we have to really make the infrastructures relevant to where they are needed at any given time. Thank you. That's,
Thank you, Thomas, and thanks again to all three panellists. I think just across three short presentations, we've seen the relevance of great data, research infrastructure, networks and physical infrastructure, and how they can all play a role, and how they're all needed to ensure that we have preparedness for pandemics. Before I head into any of my own questions, just checking if there's any early questions from the audience. Whether you want a moment to think. Go for it. The microphone coming just to you now.
Now it's on. Alan Duffy from Swinburne, Melbourne. So, Brett, hearing you say COVID has literally triggered me, man. It's brutal. This guy was on my morning TV every day during COVID, if you didn't know. It was a more general question about the level to which government has embraced and learned and embedded the lessons of pandemic response more generally. Because from the outside, it certainly appears that we are in a rush to forget. Certainly I am, but I wonder, from your views on the inside now as part of these functions, are you still getting the attention of government, or have they moved on? And that was an open question, but it was really Brett, particularly.
No, thank you. You're triggered and I'm triggered back, so yeah, here we go. Look, it's a good question. I think the proof is in the pudding. We shouldn't dive one way or the other, either in terms of a lack of faith that those lessons have been learned, or that we're charging ahead with all the preparedness in the world. I think, like many things, the truth is somewhere in between. My suspicion is that the ongoing developments necessary for the best pandemic preparedness will be led by the ground up through the scientists and researchers and those involved in both the response agencies, but also at that foundational level, like the scientists working at the ACDP that are going to continue to drive the things that we need. We do have the Australian Centre for Disease Control that has a $250 million commitment. It's going through a co-design process now. There's an opportunity for you and everyone else in the Australian and broader ecosystem to provide commentary on what they feel is a critical necessity in an Australian CDC, which to my mind means that the deep data interoperability across state and territory borders, but also across animal, environment and human health sectors, informed by Indigenous knowledges, informed by the robust adaptability that we know that we're going to need in pandemic preparedness, because we were hit by a coronavirus, but the next one could be back to our classic influenza. We know that Mpox is one of those emergent families of viruses, and Henipaviruses, again, with the work of ACDP in the background, could be that next family. So it needs ongoing work, and we're certainly not there, but I think even if a lot of us want it in the rear vision mirror, and I think that's an emotional truth for almost everyone, the intellectual pressure to continue to do the work necessary is still there.
Maybe I could just share some insight from my engagement. So, for example, we know that in Australia, that is the Australian CDC. There's a lot of funding going into Melbourne. And I can also share with you that in Korea and in Japan there is investment in this. But when I talk to my colleagues in Taiwan and Hong Kong, the answer is no. And in EU, for example, HERA is a big, ambitious project, but in the last year, I was also told by my colleagues that funding has been reduced a bit. And of course, we know all about UK, right? Recovery program was defunded by the government and all that. So I think it's really important for, as Brett mentioned, it's ground up, right? So there'll be agency level things like CSIRO, there'll be ACDP, then there'll be scientists in different parts of the world to continue moving this, because we know that after SARS in 2003, the enthusiasm lasted about 2 to 3 years. And if it was sustained, perhaps we would have done better this time. And so this is the whole idea about the importance of global cooperation in pandemic preparedness.
Yeah, you made, I think I heard 2 statements. One is whether the governments have forgotten or quickly, and the other one was what is very important is that we have a bottom-up reaction. And I think from the example I gave from the COVID pandemic, I would say, at least in our field, scientific computing and data, the government, I don't know if they forgot or whether it is that they never really understood. PRACE is an organization that was organized bottom-up between different infrastructures in different countries, and where a scientific steering committee would play an essential role to formulate the scientific case and you know, how to prepare the community, and that's a bottom-up organization. It has, or is being replaced by a commission driven, European Commission driven EuroHPC, which is a top-down organization and is very political. I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm standing on the feet of a few program managers maybe in the room, but it is very political. And this is not a good preparation for whatever crisis is coming in the future. And so is it forgetting or understanding? I don't know. We just need to help. I think this is what scientists have to do, is help our governments understand how to organize science.
Thanks for the great question. And maybe just to, I guess, extend on that same theme, and this might be for you, David, as a starting point, but happy for others to pick it up. You talked about a regional network. How do you maintain that in the absence of pandemics?
So when we started conceptualizing it, we were focused on what is likely to shut down society. So we thought that respiratory infections are important. But at the same time, we realized that whatever we want to establish or fund must also be relevant to our partners. So for example, in a workshop that we had on clinical trials, there's a lot of call for research in dengue as well as antibiotic resistance. And, but the funders are not that interested in antibiotic resistance. So we have to find a sort of platform or how to frame the issue in order to interest the funders. I mean, for example, SEPI wants to fund regional networks, but when I talk to them about antibiotic resistance as a model for clinical trial response in the next outbreak, they say AMR is not in their mission. So it's very difficult. And so as you can see, you know, at least after 2 years, what we have is a prospective surveillance study on respiratory infections, and that builds capacity in the doctors in doing the study, in the scientists in doing genomics, and also the REMAP-CAP clinical trial is one of 2 or 3 successful platform trials in the pandemic that will train the doctors in randomized control trial. To a lot of people, you know, adaptive platform trial is a mystery, is very intimidating. But once they've been socialized through the process, at the next outbreak, they will say, oh, I can do it. And we are working together currently with Oxford Forensic Science Institute, led by Peter Hobby and Wellcome Trust, to fund a adaptive platform trial in dengue. Because this is important because it's not about what we want to fund, it's about what the people that our partners in the region want to do, and dengue is important to them. So, but just say SARS-3 comes, or the H5N1 really jumps after 2 decades. These people will be ready to collect samples to run the clinical trials in that major outbreak. So the whole idea is keep the system warm, and it's not getting us. We're not spending that much money, but it's enough money to keep people warm. We're not going to have a network like the NIH trials, all over the world. Just enough to keep enough people warm so that they can be their experts in their country, in their region.
Thanks, Dave. Anyone else want to pick it up? No?
Yeah, Richard Dickman. I've just got a question. Brett, you made some indirect reference or via your presentation to kind of One Health concepts, and I know this is about preparedness, but the whole thing of addressing potential sources and actually stopping or preventing pandemics from happening, is that actually possible, or is it just too sensitive to go there? I'd appreciate some comments on that.
No, look, I think it's possible. I don't think that it is most likely to arise in Australia, or indeed in much of the Western world. The human-animal interface is where the risk is really manifest, and that's where the effort needs to go. I don't think that means that we shouldn't work through a One Health lens. It just means that we shouldn't think that applying a One Health lens is going to do all of the work in the prevention space. I think that's a global challenge. There are others, including in France, that are working on that globally. But the One Health approach is extremely useful for surveillance purposes, for early warning, and for the kind of data integration that allows us to be able to stratify the risk appropriately so that we know where to focus and so that we can ready our actions appropriately. I think Mpox, JEV, H5N7, H5N1, all great examples of where a One Health lens can be extremely useful in the kind of preparedness and mitigation activity. And I think, Mpox, to Thomas's point, is a great example, though, of unless it's in front of your face, you just don't see sufficient action. We should have had more in the way of vaccine deployment and the overcoming regulatory barriers and distribution and funding, as well as a deeper and better characterisation of Mpox in terms of its virulence and human transmissibility, because it's now going to swirl in sub-Saharan Africa in coming months, and it'll continue to just spill out into our countries, and it's only when we've got another significant epidemic in Australia or in North America that we'll get the concerted action that it actually requires. That's pretty disappointing, but we need to keep knocking on those doors.
Just something you said then, Tip, to me. Been sitting here thinking about this from a cell-based model perspective. We saw so many groups do drug screens when I worked on Hendra with the Hendra group, but I mean when SARS-CoV-2 came out, and no one was ready to have the cell models to be perfect. Is that something we should be thinking about Mpox now? Do we know the cell systems? Can we grow them in a 384 well or 1536 well format? Do we have the readouts ready if we need to do sort of an understanding of the next cultivar virus that comes out?
I've got an ID physician next to me.
Cell models, I think, is probably common, but I think, there's a few things about learning about a new disease. So bioinformatics will help, right? So if you have a new virus, a new structure, it'll help tell you what is the target, how does it work with your antibody or your drugs. But increasingly, we're thinking about organoids. Because that features more, it's more relevant in disease. And so one of our projects is actually curating relevant organoids from relevant animal species, like pigs, chicken, poultry, and humans, so that we can study them. And we will obviously study in the independent period with SARS-1, SARS-2, and avian influenza. But if any of the new evolving viruses jump, it will be relevant. So, it's a very active area. At least from our brainstorming, from our internal review, we thought that beyond cell-based system. But I think AI is also quite important, because I've recent discussion with Imperial about looking at, why wait? Because we know the genetic sequences in the animal sector, you can potentially, develop pseudoviruses and study them. In fact, on the One Health issue, that question, we recently worked with UKRI. In fact, last week I was in Kuala Lumpur. We were reviewing grants. There's a lot of projects on this. But the one that Singapore is working with UKRI on is involve colleagues in Cambodia and Vietnam, because they always have avian influenza spillover. And we also know from work from EcoHealth Alliance that the spillover of sarbecoviruses and also avian influenza are ongoing in Southeast Asia. Why wait till there's an outbreak? But how do you tell about subclinical or the occasional clusters? So you use next generation technology in terms of serology, in terms of sequencing, in terms of T cells to interrogate them. And if you can detect that, then of course we have long-lived immunity, long-lived memory B cells, then you can actually harvest. Now, of course, whatever antibody you will get, like the Regeneron, the AstraZeneca, and so on, may not be the perfect match for the next virus that caused the outbreak, but it will provide some coverage for the first 3 to 6 months. We have a paper currently under review modeling that. Of course, modeling is just modeling. Whatever you put in, you get whatever you go out, but it will buy you time. So I think One Health is totally important in pandemic preparedness, but how do we fund it? Like, do we do another major project on looking for viruses in the animals? I think we probably look at the interface of animal and humans rather than just in the animals. So there are a lot of viruses in bats, but not all of them will jump.
Andrew Howard from NCI. I kind of come at this from the HPC point of view. As a global HPC community, were we agile enough to assist you with what you needed? Are there new things we should be looking at now to prepare for the next outbreak that we're going to experience? And how can we kind of assist in, how do we bring the medical side of it into the HPC space?
I think from a practical point of view, I see AI as a big opportunity in this particular domain, and I think more generally to bring HPC results faster into society. What we call in the climate domain AI on top, where you take output from simulations, output models that you scale, etc., and you can use them together, augment them with AI. This is a huge opportunity that I see we have. And what we need to do to be better prepared is we need to invest more into being able to load data from wherever it comes from into these models and training and assimilate the data. This is something that we're not used to do in the HPC community, but we have to get better at. And the advantage that we have, or the other thing that we need to try to do is models, clinical models are being developed in many places without really thinking about scaling or improving performance. But when you have to react to any type of crisis, and pandemics, epidemics in particular, the time factor is critical. And when things hit, then you don't have time to prepare. So we need to invest into preparing the implementation of these models to perform and to scale. That's I think the two most important things: data and making sure the software performs and scales.
And the other important thing I'd add is, your prompt is one about having the conversations. I don't think we know what it can offer, and I think we need to explore it. And 5 years ago, we couldn't have dreamed of the things that it's doing now. We can't dream of the things that it's going to be able to do in 5 years' time. We need to keep eyes up, keep the conversation going, because it'll be, the biomolecular interrogation, it'll be the big data analytics from the high throughput genomics, it'll be the agent-based modelling and applications there, it'll be air particle physics to inform transmission, And all of those things will allow us to target our actions appropriately so that some of those terrible unintended consequences in lockdown, in responses, can be much, much more tailored so that we understand where best effort can be applied.
Yeah, so Debbie asked the question in terms of how do you maintain the networks in the absence of pandemic, but I almost want to ask the complementary or opposite question is, in a pandemic, how do you maintain the sort of open collaboration, the open networks, particularly in an environment where, you know, there are increasing geopolitical tensions and so on? I think, how do you build a resilient collaboration and network that will sort of survive that sort of nationalistic type impact of having a pandemic out there where everybody wants to look after their own population first?
I think this is where science and the culture of science really comes in. And the bottom-up part, the thing that individuals or research groups around the globe have to identify with what they do. And I'm a strong believer in these bottom-up methods. That's why I fell in love with this Data Science Africa organization that's doing a lot of things much better than we do in Switzerland in data science. Because bottom-up, people have ownership of what they do and then promote the international exchange. These are things that will survive a crisis. If you have a top-down organization and you take out the command, nothing works anymore. You create a culture of people who wait for orders, and that you don't want to have. You want people who are self-motivated and have identify with the problems and the opportunities. And that's not true just for pandemic response, that's true for any response.
I might even add to that, ditto with what Thomas said, absolutely. Scientists like to share, and as long as the trust is there, and I think what David's highlighted around maintaining pandemic preparedness when there aren't pandemics is hugely important. If there's the trust there on existing networks, then that facilitates the sharing of science. So yeah, I think though keeping those networks going, which does take money to support, but that's hugely important to facilitating rapid, trusted sharing of information within pandemic.
And I don't know who's involved in supporting governments for pandemic treaty negotiations, but that's going to be a foundational piece. It's really, really tricky work. I don't know that I'm super optimistic that it'll be landed in the early part of next year. But you know, the inputs that we should all be making to our governments is it is in our own best interests to provide the kind of equitable sharing of data, biologics, and the therapeutics and vaccines globally. It is in our best interests to make sure that we've got equitable settling of terms with lower and middle income countries, because at the moment it's a mad scramble for our share, and that doesn't serve us well as we've seen over the last 5 years.
Perhaps just to respond to that question, they take the example of two important clinical trials in the pandemic, recovery. It remained in UK for most of the pandemic. It only became international in the last 2 years. REMAP-CAP, established after pandemic 2009, was already operating internationally, and it was able to basically scale very quickly. So that's the whole idea. I think in a pandemic, in research collaboration, it's always about ethics, agreement, as well as policy. And I think in a major crisis like the COVID pandemic, there's a lot of willingness to collaborate. It's more importantly, it's about this new drug, this new vaccine. I develop it. How much do you pay me? Those things are probably second order. And in a pandemic, that's when the agency like WHO came in, although they are a bit slow. But at least on the ground, we can have this network ready. People know each other. They know all the biggest barrier. I'm not sure about outside of medicine. Outside of medical research, in medical research, the biggest barrier to research is actually non-medical. It's about ethics agreement and all that. So we try to sort of harmonize all this, socialize all this so that it'd be quick for the next outbreak.
Thank you. Hi, Adam from UK, and I wasn't, just for the record, the person who cancelled the recovery trial, just in case anyone else. No, we haven't talked about AI enough for the host. We have to talk about it in every session, but actually it's a genuine question. The power of AI to do prediction and predictive AI may get us to a point where we can have structural biology prediction of future mutants and understand whether or not the vaccine is going to work. We might be able to do epidemiological prediction of, we think the next big global virus will be swine flu based coming out of China. Now, we can do that on a binary and we can do that globally, but I guess the challenge and question for you is, what happens when we get our AI systems to crunch the numbers and they go, disagree, and we go, right, it's swine flu out of China, let's ban all Chinese flights for the next 6 months just in case. Oh no, it's out of Africa and it's a different disease and we have to do this. And we actually end up with worrying, say national level data coming out, but it's not consistent enough. But we don't want to be the ones who ignored the data and then have a crisis. So I wonder, if we do have AI systems predicting the future and it's not a single prediction, how we manage that.
Yeah, I'm ready to dive in. Read the book Radical Uncertainty. I think we tend to think that AI will solve in the same way that high-powered computing can do this, because it's a lack of data or data integration that is the issue. But there are genuine, complex and sometimes chaotic causal relationships. And I don't think AI is going to solve that. I think there'll be human intuition that will always have a role. And to quote Donald Rumsfeld, the unknown unknowns, they will always be out of our reach. And I think they're going to be at play with what the future scenario planning capability is. I think we should use it to the fullest extent that we can, but I think we should always challenge the notion that it's going to have a definitive answer for us that we're ignoring at our peril.
So welcome to the world of climate modeling and predictions. That's the same thing there. It's just that in the case of climate modeling, the physics is better understood, and there is a lot of effort and time to describe this one system that we have. In the case of pandemic responses using AI to predict those, I don't think we should create that problem. I think because that's what, if we think AI can make those predictions, we create the problem of managing those. That's what your question is. And I'm not sure that's a useful way of spending our resources. It's more important that we train ourselves to use prepared data that we have before a pandemic, before a crisis, train ourselves to use AI on top of what we have otherwise in modeling to make the results from models more quickly relevant, more immediately relevant to societal problems. And if we have the structure, we have the trust that we build, I think we should focus on those things. And we have the culture in science to do these things, then we are ready to respond in a civilized way when a crisis hits.
So there's AI and there's AI. So, in a pandemic, there are so many AI papers about what is the best drug for COVID, right? But I also need to remember that benevolent AI was the first to say it may work. But it didn't go to treatment immediately, right? Eli Lilly did laboratory work, NIH laboratory work to actually validate it. So it needs validation, as Brett mentioned. It cannot just be AI-driven. But what we should do now really is to fund, people to develop good AI models. But in science, it's a bit different. Using protein large language model, for example, to look at protein structures should be better than a human because it's just faster. But you do have to have a scientist, to actually look at that. It cannot just be the machine telling you that this is the right way to go. Having said that, there's a recent paper that just came out in the top journal comparing AI in diagnosis of medicine, of diseases, compared to doctors alone and doctors in AI. Actually, the machine beats doctors with AI or doctors alone. It's a bit scary, but it basically tells you that we have to learn how to harness the potential of AI. This is not just your machine language, machine learning on your network. This is actually generative AI, and try how to use them in a purposeful manner that will achieve our aims. I don't think enough is being done currently, although I know there are funded projects, but it's important to, some of them will fail, but some of them may succeed.
We might squeeze in one last question before we head to afternoon tea.
Hi, Jeremy Brownlee from Griffith University. So a number of the facilities here are around disease surveillance and defining the pathogens, but I'm just wondering then, during a response, there's that next level of infrastructure that's required to scale up the response. Do we have sufficient infrastructure in place for that? I mean, there's a number of institutes, for example, that are scaling up RNA vaccines around the world. That's sort of the hot topic at the moment, but are we locking ourselves into one technology over others? Is there, I guess, seeking comment around that?
Yeah, good question. I think in the Australian context, it's probably less an issue of major production gaps being missing or scalable opportunities being missing, and a bigger issue of having the connectedness between all of the relevant parts. That goes to having behavioural science incorporated into pandemic responses. That goes to the issue of dis and miscommunication being part of a pandemic response as much as vaccine production. But it also goes to that whole vaccine value chain. We are great in the discovery space. Australia is brilliant in the clinical trial space. We're pretty terrible in the national real-time surveillance space. The UK could do a PCR across their entire population every week to inform household attack rates and secondary attack rates. We couldn't do it at all. And that's not a failure of the technical capability, it's a failure of the kind of ethics and infrastructure of collaboration in Australia. And so I think we should work on that for the entire vaccine value chain so that we see it as a product development pathway from go to woe. And we can work on the elements that are not as strong there. Yeah, that's my general view. I don't know if there are other issues in Singapore or Switzerland that.
I think there's a lot of after-action reviews, and there are also efforts to look at the gaps. So, for example, there is the RNA foundry is supposed to produce mRNA affordably for MIC, distributed across different regions. I mean, obviously, each country will look after its own population first, but at the same time, there is genuine international efforts. A lot of this may fail because the pandemic treaty that Brett mentioned is already stalled, the timeline is already exceeded, but some of that may succeed. We don't know whether we'll be better off, but if you don't try, you will never know. I still think mRNA is the fastest you can go. I mean, for protein subunit, the only one that can match protein subunit mRNA speed is the one from University of Queensland. Everything else is extremely slow and didn't make an impact on the pandemic. So, but it is a opportunity to fund research. So that's why we're not saying that we don't fund it. But a lot of governments focus on RNA, but it probably won't be the only answer.
No, we're right. So we'll let you get to afternoon tea now. Thank you for being a fantastic audience with great questions, and thanks once again to each of our panellists.